Everybody's seen a cowboy movie. White hat hero, evil Indian, blonde damsel, a 5-minute shootout. All lies. The real Old West was way crazier, more violent, more unfair, and way more interesting. Today you're going to hear 20 real stories that sound like movie scripts, but actually happened. Grab your coffee, lock the door, and come with me. Because after this video, you'll never look at a Western the same way again. Number 1. Bass Reeves, the real Lone Ranger. Bass Reeves was born enslaved in the American South, escaped during the Civil War, and ended up on the rough frontier, where he learned to speak with several indigenous nations. Years later, he became a federal deputy marshal, patrolling a huge area, bigger than many states combined. They say he arrested more than 3,000 outlaws and was obsessed with doing everything by the book. He didn't take bribes and almost never had to shoot first. He always carried his handcuffs on one side and a Bible on the other, treating outlaws like human beings, but never letting anyone off easy. Decades later in Hollywood, they created the Lone Ranger, a masked hero with an indigenous partner, a white horse, and a strict code of honor that looked awfully familiar. They just forgot to mention that in real life, this hero was a black man named Bass Reeves. Today, a lot of people still haven't even heard his name. Number 2. Pinkerton, the billionaires' private army. In the late 19th century, when the big steel and railroad barons wanted to keep everything under control, they called in the men from the Pinkerton Agency. It wasn't just private detective work, it operated like a rented army. They escorted money shipments, spied on union meetings, and when talking didn't solve things, they showed up with clubs, guns, and uniforms, with no badges. In the famous Homestead conflict in Pennsylvania, they arrived by boat, armed to the teeth, to break the strike and protect the factory, not the workers. The idea was simple. If the government took too long or stayed on the fence, the billionaires paid for their own law enforcement. This model of private security paved the way for a debate that still exists today. How far does money's power go when it comes to who gets to use force? And a lot of people came to see the Pinkertons as the symbol of that. Number 3. Charley Parkhurst, the woman who fooled the entire West. In the middle of the California gold rush, there was a person everyone swore was the classic tough guy of the West, Charley Parkhurst. He drove stagecoaches on bandit-filled roads, spat on saloon floors, smoked cigars, and cursed in ways that would make a sailor blush. In 1868, he showed up at the voting booth and cast his ballot for president, decades before any woman in the United States had that right. When he died in 1879, the shock came. The doctor and the people preparing the body discovered that he was actually Charlotte. The whole town realized they'd spent years being fooled by someone who had quietly broken every gender rule there was. And even so, Charley was still remembered as one of the best stagecoach drivers the West had ever seen. To this day, historians debate whether it was rebellion, survival, or pure desire for freedom. Number 4. The biggest scam in the American Old West. After the gold rush, when everyone was still dreaming of getting rich overnight, 2 swindlers showed up with the perfect story. They claimed to have found a lost hill in Colorado where the ground was full of diamonds and rubies. They secretly scattered fake stones around the place, brought bankers and big shots from back east, and let everyone kneel down, picking treasures out of the gravel, and, of course, pulling out their checkbooks. Money poured in from major banks, politicians, and even a Rockefeller relative. Converted to today's values, it would be billions of reais in investment. What ruined the party was geologist Clarence King, who calmly examined the site, realized none of it made sense, and proved it was all a setup. By the time the truth reached the public, the two men had already vanished with the money, leaving a lot of important people looking foolish and a big warning about greed and easy fantasy. Number 5. Johnson County War, the rich men who declared war. In 1892, in northern Wyoming, a group of big cattle barons decided they no longer wanted to share the region with small ranchers and homesteaders. They made a list with dozens of names, calling these folks cattle thieves, often without a shred of proof. Instead of taking the case to court, they pooled their money, boarded a train to Texas, and hired about 50 gunmen to solve the problem by force. When the armed group entered Johnson County, news spread fast. Ranchers, shopkeepers, and workers dropped what they were doing, grabbed whatever weapons they had, and surrounded the group at a ranch. The tension got so bad that Washington sent in the U.S. Army, not to protect the locals, but to escort the rich men and their hired guns out safely. To this day, in that corner of the West, plenty of people remember the story as the day money spoke louder than the law. Number 6. Stagecoach Mary, a woman you did not mess with. At the end of the Old West, when most women still couldn't even vote, a formerly enslaved woman named Mary Fields became a legend on the roads of Montana. She was over 50, more than 6 feet tall, built like an offensive lineman, smoked cigars, and said exactly what she thought. The government needed someone to carry the mail along a lonely route full of snow, wolves, and bandits. Mary took the contract, a .38 on her hip, a rifle on the wagon, and did the job day after day. When her horses got stuck in a blizzard and froze to death, she threw the mailbag on her back and walked miles through the darkness to the next town. Folks at the saloon joked that not even the sheriff was as scary as she was. But for anyone waiting on news from home, Mary was the one person who never failed. She didn't miss a single delivery. In those parts, that was worth more than a medal. Number 7. Buffalo Bill selling native people as a show. At the end of the 19th century, William Buffalo Bill Cody turned the indigenous massacre into arena entertainment. In his show, native performers staged attacks on settler wagons, always defeated by white heroes with rifles. Among the guests was Sitting Bull himself, the aging Sioux chief who had actually faced the U.S. Army in real battle. He agreed to travel with the troupe through Europe, even performing for Queen Victoria, but he did it for the paycheck and for the chance to look directly at the people who had declared him an enemy. Backstage, according to reports, he would often joke about how shocked audiences were to see such a savage acting so calmly, while outside the crowd walked away, believing they had witnessed the real frontier, never noticing the trick behind the show. Number 8. Belle Starr, the bandit queen nobody ever caught. At a time when the West was still wide open, Belle Starr became a legend for mixing family life with the criminal world. She dressed well, rode good horses, and wasn't afraid to pull the 2 revolvers she carried at her waist. She had ties to big names like Jesse James and Cole Younger, and knew all the routes used by robbers and cattle thieves. Married to a Cherokee man, she built a gang specialized in stealing horses and giving shelter to outlaws passing through her land. At 40, she was ambushed on a dirt road and shot in the back. To this day, no one knows for sure who pulled the trigger, which only added to the mystery around her name. Some say it was revenge from a former partner. Others blame a feud with local ranchers, but nothing was ever proven, and her story ended up somewhere between fact and barroom talk. Number 9. Alferd Packer, the cannibal who became a national joke. In early 1874, a man named Alferd Packer offered to guide 5 men through the frozen mountains of Colorado, right in the era of the Old West. Months later, he showed up alone in a small town, better fed than he should have been, and carrying the money and belongings of his companions. His story didn't add up. People got suspicious. The police dug up the area and found the bodies, cut up and partially eaten. At the trial, the judge delivered the line that turned him into a legend, saying that Packer had killed and eaten 5 Democrats. The sarcastic comeback attributed to Packer also rode the wave of notoriety. He supposedly said he'd only eaten the tender parts. Over time, the case turned into dark barroom humor, a topic for songs, B-movies, and even the name of a university cafeteria, leaving the country torn between disgust and curiosity. That's how one of the most famous cannibalism stories in American history was born. Number 10. The Chinese built America and were kicked out. If we look back to the late 19th century, we can see a detail that's almost erased from American history. On the most dangerous stretches of the railroad that crossed the country, a huge part of the workforce came from China. They were the ones hanging dynamite on cliffs, carving tunnels through snow, and facing avalanches, almost always earning less than their white co-workers. Many died there without even having their names written down anywhere. When the tracks finally linked the Atlantic to the Pacific and the profits rolled in, the attitude changed. Instead of recognition, they got the door slammed in their faces. Congress passed laws that practically blocked new Chinese immigrants and made life hard for those already here. And, like many people at the time, they couldn't even dream of citizenship. They built a massive part of the country, but were treated as if they had never existed. Number 11. The Reno Brothers, the world's first train robbers. In 1866, in rural Indiana, the Reno brothers figured out that a train was basically a giant safe on rails. They and their gang boarded at night, overpowered the crew, uncoupled the front cars, and forced the engineer to pull ahead a short distance. Far from the station and any help, they broke into the mail car and took about $13,000, a fortune at the time. It wasn't just a successful robbery. It showed everyone that a train could be hit just like a moving bank. Years later, names like Jesse James and Butch Cassidy would repeat the same playbook, turning train robbery into a classic symbol of the Old West. For men returning from the Civil War with no money and no direction, hitting the rails seemed like easy business, almost no law around, slow communication, and lots of federal money rolling through every night. Number 12. Hell's Court. In the late 19th century, in Fort Smith, Arkansas, the federal court became a topic of conversation across the country. In charge was Judge Isaac C. Parker, whom many began calling the hanging judge. He presided over hundreds of trials for crimes committed on the frontier, a territory where the law usually arrived late. Over the course of his career, 172 defendants heard their final sentence from him, and 88 ended up on the gallows set up beside the fort. On execution days, lines of men with their hands bound walked across the hard-packed dirt yard under the silent gaze of the crowd. Guards said that even before the bell rang, you could feel a heavy smell in the air, sweat, alcohol, and pure fear, as if the frontier itself were holding its breath. For many men of that generation, Fort Smith became a symbol of a time when the rope was seen as a quick answer to chaos. Number 13. Laura Bullion, the only woman in Butch Cassidy's gang. In all the Old West legends, hardly anyone talks about Laura Bullion, the only woman who actually became part of Butch Cassidy's wild bunch. The daughter of a cowboy and used to rough road life from an early age, she started carrying a gun, helping with train robberies, and passing counterfeit money to keep the gang going. She used documents under different names, cut her hair short when she needed to disappear, and spent her life dodging sheriffs and Pinkerton agents. She was arrested in 1901, still young, served time in New York, and when she got out in 1905, she dropped her outlaw name and tried to live as a respectable lady, working in hotels and boarding houses and avoiding any talk about her past. She died in 1961, quietly, in an America already full of cars, airplanes, and color TV, taking with her memories of a West that felt like it belonged to another world. Number 14. Elfego Baca, 19 years old, faced 80 cowboys alone. In the late 19th century, in a New Mexico that was still almost lawless, a young man named Elfego Baca, only 19, decided to become a sheriff and stand up to Texas cowboys who did whatever they wanted in Mexican villages. After he arrested one of them, about 80 armed riders surrounded the house where Elfego was holed up. A shootout began, not one that lasted minutes, but a day and a half. It's estimated that more than 4,000 shots hit the walls, doors, and furniture. When the smoke cleared, Elfego walked out alive, practically unharmed, while at least 4 men were dead and others wounded. Years later, he traded the badge for a suit, becoming a lawyer and local politician, carrying the reputation of a man who had stood his ground alone against what looked like a small army. For many people of the time, this story became guaranteed saloon talk, proof of how a stubborn guy could turn into a legend. Number 15. Pearl Hart, the last stagecoach bandit. At the end of the Old West, when almost every outlaw had already disappeared, a young Canadian woman named Pearl Hart decided to jump into crime in a way no one expected. She cut her hair short, put on a man's coat and hat, and grabbed a .38 revolver. In 1899, near Globe, Arizona, she stopped a stagecoach, took the passengers' money, and walked off with about $430. Good money for the time. What shocked the public wasn't just the robbery, but the fact that it was a woman doing something seen as a man's job. Newspapers grabbed onto the story, wrote flashy headlines, magazines printed her face, and she became a sort of crime celebrity. She was tried and convicted, got 5 years, but spent little time behind bars. After about a year and a half, she was released on the excuse that prison wasn't a place for a lady. Number 16. The missing pterodactyl photo. In 1890, a small newspaper in Tombstone, Arizona, claimed that some hunters had brought down a huge pterodactyl in the desert. They said the creature had been stretched out against a wooden wall, with the men posing beside it, and that this scene was printed in one of those yellowed newspapers you imagine lying around in a frontier saloon. The original image vanished from archives and private collections. Ever since, curious folks have dug through microfilm, auctions, and attics, looking for a single negative that could prove whether the story was just saloon talk or a record of something nobody could properly explain. As with so many Old West tales, the more time passes, the more people swear they've seen that picture somewhere. But no one can show where, which only deepens the question of whether we're dealing with bad memory, a printing trick, or a forgotten piece of prehistory dropping into the 19th century out of nowhere. Number 17, the most honest tombstone in the West. In Boot Hill Cemetery in Tombstone, Arizona, there's one of those stories every old cowboy loves to tell. A man named Lester Moore worked for a delivery agency and ended up in a nasty fight over a package. In the Old West, arguments quickly turned into gunfire, and he took 4 bullets from a .44 revolver. He never had a chance to draw his own gun, no doctor was nearby, and he died right there. Back then, the sheriff showed up after the dust had already settled, and justice almost always came at the barrel of a gun. Years later, someone decided to mark his grave with a short, straight-to-the-point message, mixing dry humor with tragedy. The line became a local legend, repeated in bars, in conversations, and on guided tours. Since then, travelers stop in front of the tombstone, let out a half-smile, tip their hat out of respect, and remember how life out there could end in the blink of an eye. Number 18, Rattlesnake. Dick and the gold no one ever found. During the gold rush, the outlaw Richard Rattlesnake Dick Barter vanished into the Sierra Nevada mountains carrying the spoils of a major robbery, about $80,000 worth of gold at the time, enough money to change a family's life for generations. Chased by pauses and sheriffs, he decided to hide the bars and nuggets in a remote spot, marked landmarks on rocks and trees, and later scribbled a map full of crooked notes, arrows, and mile measurements. The story goes that this map passed from hand to hand through dusty saloons, ranchers' drawers, and junk shop auctions, but no one ever managed to decode the exact route. The gold is still buried somewhere in the Sierra, waiting for the bad luck of those who search for it, and the luck of whoever happens to stumble across it by accident. Number 19, the last real shootout of the Old West. In January 1919, in a small Nevada town, the Old West was already almost movie material, but there were still men who settled scores with a trigger. 2 guys who had hated each other for ages faced off right in the middle of the main street, each with a well-worn revolver. Shop doors stayed half open, people peeked from behind the windows, and no one dared step in. They traded a few words, short, sharp, and the talk ended the moment their hands dropped to their holsters. Shots echoed, wood splintered, dust jumped into the air, and both men went down with mortal wounds. As they lay dying on the hard dirt street, a different sound cut through the silence. The town's first automobile rolled down that same street, horn blaring nonstop, as if announcing that the old way of settling scores was ending. And a new era was beginning right there. Number 20, the West never ended. In the end, the so-called frontier never really closed. It just moved from the Dakota Plains to Wall Street, to oil fields, to glass offices, and to homebroker screens. The duels left the holster and slipped into contracts, into fights over land, water, and data. The clothes change, the setting changes, but the game stays the same. Whoever controls the money and the information sets the pace, and everyone else runs to keep up. If you stuck with me this far, you can already see the Old West hiding behind today's headlines. Tell me, which part of this story surprised you the most? Drop it in the comments. Hit like, subscribe, ring the bell, and come along. because next week there's more behind-the-scenes stuff that never makes it into the movies. And don't forget, reality always outguns the screenwriters. See you next time, cowboy.